I've discovered this paper, which is from the. It was presented to the Royal Astronomical Society in 1991, and I got a copy from NASA, the Astrophysics Data System. And I thought if I could read you a bit out about from here, which is talking about the Magi, it basically shows that the events recorded in the Gospels are backed up by science and observations, and fully consistent with history of the time. And I'm sure you you know an awful lot more about this topic than.
Well, I've got a paper too, Phil, to show you. Look, this is mine.
Oh, great! Yeah.
So I've opened my paper, a slightly older document than yours.
Yes. Well, this refers to that one. Cheeky. I don't know if that's you or me.
Just returning to the source documents of my profession as well.
Right. Yes. So yeah, we're trying to get to the bottom of who the Magi actually were.
Yeah.
Whether they were real or mystical, or magical, or what.
I think you're illustrating an important point, because I do know that a number of theologians think that the whole visit of the Magi around the birth of Christ is a purely mythological event to support the claims of Jesus. So it'd be interesting to hear what science has got to offer on that perspective, Phil.
Yeah, well, this is a very well-researched paper by the look of it. It has quite a stack of references at the bottom. But let me just read you a bit from the summary and conclusions. So he says here, the Magi are well known in classical literature as a religious group who were skilled in the observation and interpretation of the stars. At the time of Christ, they mainly lived in Persia, Mesopotamia, and Arabia, and they are known to have visited kings in other countries. It's therefore consistent with our knowledge of the Magi that an astronomical sign could have led them to visit a new king. So these people were well known for traveling around, and later in the document it says, it is suggested that a combination of three unusual and significant astronomical events caused the Magi to set off on their journey. First, there was the triple conjugation of Saturn and Jupiter in the constellation Pisces in 7 BC. Such an event occurs every 900 years. And the
Is that the same constellation conjunction that we've just witnessed in the past few weeks?
Yes. And I remember people talking about that. So then the probable astrological significance of this event to the Magi was that a divine king would be born in Israel. Second, in 6 BC, there was a massing of the three planets, Mars, Saturn, and Jupiter in Pisces. Such a massing occurs every 800 years and very much more infrequently in Pisces. And it would have confirmed to the Magi that the king to be born in Israel would be a mighty king. Third, a comet appeared in 5 BC in the east in the constellation Capricornus. In the astrology of the time, a comet in the east signified a rapidly approaching event. The comet was therefore the third and final sign which caused the Magi to set off on their journey. And this chap reckons it would take them 1 to 2 months for the journey. It is shown that the probable significance of the comet in Capricornus to the Magi was also that a very great king was about to be born. So that's a very brief summary of quite a lengthy document here, which also goes into, what time of year Christ might have been born. Interestingly, because with those three astronomical events over the space of 2 years, he's suggesting that might be why Herod massacred children up to 2 years old. But this is sort of one source. Well, how does this fit with what you've known and learned and grown up with?
I think it would be interesting to put that against the document in the scripture and draw some parallels or some support that that document can give. I do think it's actually important for us first to log the fact that the story of the visit of the Magi is only recorded for us in Matthew. It's not recorded anywhere else. What makes that interesting is that we think Matthew's gospel, of course, was written for Jewish people, and yet he records Gentiles visiting the Christ child. Now, for me, that's always been one of the aspects of this story that suggests the truth of it rather than its mythological origins. So if you take Luke's story of Christmas Day, and we do know Luke's talking about Christmas Day because of the language he uses, he has Jews visiting Jesus, but Matthew, writing for Jews, has Gentiles missing. Why didn't they just swap the stories to support the document that they got? But they didn't swap the stories. So Matthew has obviously found a piece of information which he feels is vitally important, but he doesn't swap it with Luke, so that Luke writes for Gentiles, Matthew writes for Jews, and it's nice and tidy. And the fact that it's untidy, and they've kept that untidiness alive, does suggest to me that there's something in this story which is an echo of reality. And that's what I think your document is actually saying to us. Now, in the scripture, it talks then about wise men coming from the east, Magi coming from the east. Again, your document seems to support that issue. And certainly I was brought up being informed that the wise men would be the wise men of the court of Persia, which was a very powerful empire at the very edge of the Roman Empire. The Empire of Rome and the Empire of Persia kind of collide just to the east of Jerusalem. And the Persian Empire very much took account of the stars for information as to what was happening. And that gives us a clue, I suggest, and you do actually have to play Cluedo with it, gives us a clue as to what religion the wise men may well have been. And I would suggest we look at Zoroastrianism for that, which is still a living religion today. It's still a live religion. And in the Zoroastrian religion, people worship Aurora Mazda, which translates as the Lord of Light. And when you consider that Christians think of Jesus as bringing the light of Christ, bringing the light of God to us, and that insight of God, it's a very interesting thing. But in Zoroastrianism, light and darkness are in perfect balance. So it's known as a dualistic religion.
Right. And
there's a constant war going on between light and darkness. And by looking at the stars, the wise men would have recognized that Aurora Mazda has actually played the next card in this battle. And these stars appearing, perhaps in the pattern that you have suggested from that document, would be, they're coming to find out what Aurora Mazda has actually done in this latest battle.
That sort of raises an interesting question, which is around that, and I've been thinking about this. So I don't believe in horoscopes and astrologists and all of that, and yet here we have some attested occurrences which were interpreted, as you're describing, by people in a religion that I've only just heard of. And these things are being taken to point at Jesus as being a mighty king.
Indeed.
Now, if I'd been reading this at the time, I'd be thinking, well, I think that's just a sort of wacky conspiracy. But looking back on it, I suppose there's a bit of a temptation to say, well, perhaps there is something in astrology. What do you think?
I think that there's a cultural element here that we need to take account of. In Jesus' time, there was no division amongst the academic disciplines. So science and religion were not separate. And indeed, up till the Middle Ages, in our own experience, the same would have been true. So people would have looked at the stars for information about the God of creation. And I think that Christianity itself didn't come out very firmly against astrology until very late on. The Enlightenment really was when it kind of capped that. And we live in an age where we've come out against astrology. But certainly in Jesus' time, there would have been no problem in interpreting the stars as revealing to you God's will.
But my question is really, what is the truth? So did the star actually were the Magi correct in their interpretation? I mean, we believe that they were.
Yeah.
But was that coincidence, or it's a little bit of a paradox, isn't it?
It is a paradox.
Yes, we don't believe in astrology, and yet here's astrology predicting the most important event in history,
and leading members of another religion to find Christ.
Indeed.
Yeah, it is a paradox, and it's one that the Christian Church is not comfortable with in our age. And I think the reason we're not comfortable with it is, certainly in my experience, I found and had to engage with people whose lives are utterly and totally controlled by what they read in the horoscopes and in the stars, so to speak. There's no liberty, there's no freedom, because they won't act unless they're authorized to do so by these mechanisms. And it's that enslavement element, I think, that the church has stood against. It's a controlling mechanism that the church says shouldn't be there. We should be free. And that's why we've come out against it.
But it's an interesting mystery, isn't it? Yes.
Well, it's not the only thing in Christianity where our opinion has changed. I mean, let's not forget that at the time of Jesus, slavery was an acceptable thing for humanity. And it took until the 17th century for the Protestant churches to come out and say, no, that's actually contradictory to God's will, and people like Wilberforce forced a change of mindset, where we now understand that the liberty that Christ brings to us means that we've got no rights to enslave another human being, either by action or indeed by words.
I can see the topic for another conversation there, but
Indeed, yeah. Let's go back to the Epiphany and carry on with our exploration there. Okay. I mean, you talked about the fact that the stars, the combination of these stars, are between 7 and 5 BC. Well, I think that fits with our knowledge that King Herod, for instance, died in 4 BC.
Right.
So we've got a pack of astrological stuff going on, which does actually fit the historical data of the king's death. And it is King Herod the Great that we're talking about here, who died in 4 BC. So since Herod, and you mentioned the slaughter of the innocents, it dies in 4 BC, those events must have taken place before 4 BC. And that's an interesting correlation, I think, between your document and what we know from the scriptural and historical record of the time.
Yes. The other thing in here was they were looking at when there were Roman censuses, and the implication is that this was not this was not for tax purposes, but it was to find out the number of male people in the area. And again, they think that there is a consistency with the date of one of the censuses.
Just remember that the record of the fact that Jesus, Mary and Joseph go to Bethlehem is actually a Lucan thing. It's not Matthew who's recording that. The census doesn't come up at all in the story of the Magi.
But it's just more evidence showing everything that we're finding. There is a consistency.
Indeed.
It's not.
I think for me, the problem I have with spinning both the Luke and the Matthew story together is that you end up with what our Christmas cards present to us as the Christmas Day story, in that you get Mary and Joseph in the middle of an English cow barn, with the shepherds to the left and the wise men to the right. And that is just not what Scripture is telling us.
Yes.
I'll go back to the documents I've got. For me, another ring of truth in this story, and by that I am meaning historicity, is that you said that the wise men would interpret the stars as looking for the birth of a new king. And so the wise men who come from the east, remembering that Israel and Persia are separated by the Arabian desert. So the length of the journey is an interesting one to ask about. there is no direct route from the center of Persia Empire to Israel. They've got to go around the top of the Fertile Crescent. That would give us a long time for their journey. And for them, you have to then think about when they might to set off. And your scholar was suggesting 2 or 3 months.
Yeah,
I would say that was a short journey, actually, probably longer. But it just depends when the star appears. But I love the bit in the story where they're following the stars, knowing they're coming to find a king. They know it's somewhere in Israel, so they end up in the capital of Israel. And where do they go to look for this king? It's like they leave the star alone at that point, and human logic breaks into the story in that we know where to find a king. We'll go to the palace. So they leave the star behind and poddle off to the palace. And of course, it's a total disaster. That's not where the king's to be found at all. And I just love the humor of human logic breaking in. These wise men just shutting the star out and going for what they know is the reality of it. He's going to be in the palace because a new prince has got to be born in the palace. No, got it wrong. Sorry. But it's another one of those rings of truth, I think, for me. And it's interesting that Herod has no idea where the new king is to be born. And he actually has to ask his own wise men. And then they quote the Hebrew scriptures for him. So you've got this, there are wise men in Persia, there are wise men in Israel. And indeed, we know that the emperors of Rome surrounded themselves with wise men as well. It's a Middle Eastern phenomenon of the time that the courts actually had these wise men in them. But I love it. I just love the fact they've got it wrong. Sorry, guys, you've got it wrong.
Yes, we had Dominic Cummings as our wise man, didn't we?
Yes. Yeah. Yes, even today, technically speaking, our politicians surround themselves with their wise men who get it wrong.
We follow the science.
Oh, yes, indeed.
Yes.
Okay. But then when the wise men do follow the science, they get back on course. Their journey takes them 6 miles south of Bethlehem, of Jerusalem to Bethlehem. Yeah.
Yes.
And that's where Matthew then clearly diverges from Luke, in that in Luke he talks about the bathos. It's a medical term, and it means a newborn baby up to 24 hours old. So that's why we know Luke is Christmas Day.
Right. Yes.
But in Matthew, it talks about the fact that the wise men enter the house and find the child, and it's a different word. The better translation of the word child would actually be toddler.
Okay. Yeah.
Okay. So we do know it's an infancy story, but not a birth narrative story.
Yes.
And they have entered the house. So why Joseph and Mary are still in Bethlehem is a good question. Don't quite know, but it would appear that Joseph has obviously found work and they've moved upstairs, basically.
Yeah, maybe.
But they're not in the stable anymore.
Yeah.